All right, let's jump into this deep dive. You know, when you sent in this article, Microaggressions in Popular Culture, are we progressing or digressing? I was immediately intrigued. Oh, I have to unpack this together. It really makes you think about all those subtle things that can actually have a huge impact.
Yeah, and that's what's so tricky about microaggressions, right? They often fly under the radar. They aren't these big, obvious acts of discrimination that are easy to spot, but these little digs that can really chip away at people, especially those from marginalized groups.
It's almost like a death by a thousand paper cuts, isn't it? The article defines microaggressions as subtle, often unintentional remarks or behaviors conveying prejudice towards a marginalized group. Just reading that definition, it made me stop and think about my own interactions. Have you ever caught yourself or wondered if you've maybe sent some of those subtle messages without even realizing it?
Oh, absolutely. That's why I think understanding this evolution of microaggressions is so crucial, especially in media. The article talks about how in those old films, the stereotypes were so blatant and in your face, almost cringeworthy. But now it seems like things have shifted to more nuanced but still problematic portrayals.
Yeah, it's like we've traded those loud, obvious stereotypes for this sort of whisper campaign of bias. The article even mentions shows like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Living Single. I mean, these were groundbreaking shows in their time for showcasing diverse characters and storylines, but even they fell into those microaggression traps sometimes.
It's interesting how those seemingly progressive shows, while trying to be more inclusive, sometimes ended up, even if accidentally, perpetuating some harmful biases. Shows just how ingrained these subtle forms of prejudice can be.
Right. Makes you really think about how we're consuming media, doesn't it? Like, have you ever noticed these more subtle forms of bias in shows that you actually enjoy? It's a reminder to be a bit more critical of what we're watching and listening to.
Absolutely. That critical lens is so important. And the article actually goes deeper into some fascinating examples of these microaggressions in film and television. This is where it gets really interesting, seeing how these concepts actually play out in popular culture.
Oh, for sure. The article talks about Michael Scott from The Office and how his jokes, about race or ethnicity were often microaggressions disguised as humor. I'm curious about your take on how comedy can sometimes be a slippery slope when it comes to these sensitive topics.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Humor can be a really powerful tool for social commentary, but it can also be used to mask prejudice. Like in Michael Scott's case, even though he might not have intended to be hurtful, his attempts to be funny often came across as, well, offensive and insensitive. And it brings up that important point. Intent doesn't necessarily negate impact, especially when those jokes reinforce harmful stereotypes.
That's a really good point. The article also brings up the example of Crazy Rich Asians, a film that was widely praised for celebrating Asian culture. But it also points out those moments where Asian characters are almost othered, with those backhanded compliments like "you're so exotic."
Right, and it's those seemingly harmless remarks that can be so damaging. Like on the surface, "you're so exotic" might sound like a compliment, but it reinforces this idea that Asian individuals are somehow outside the norm, different and not fully belonging. Kind of subtly undermines their identity and feeds into that whole perpetual foreigner stereotype.
It's almost like a reminder that even positive stereotypes can be harmful because they can box people in, right? And then there's Get Out, which the article really praises for its depiction of racial microaggressions. What stood out to you about how that film portrayed these subtle but insidious acts of prejudice?
I think Get Out brilliantly flips the script on those seemingly positive comments that are often directed toward minorities. The film really exposes how praising someone for being well-spoken or constantly talking about their athleticism can actually be a way of subtly othering them and diminishing their individuality. It's a powerful reminder that microaggressions can really lurk even in seemingly innocent conversations.
I think what was so impactful about Get Out was that it really captured how it feels to be bombarded by these microaggressions, both visually and emotionally. It really forced viewers to confront the cumulative effect of these seemingly small moments and how they create this truly hostile environment. It's not just about one comment, it's about this constant drip, drip, drip of subtle prejudice.
Exactly, and that's why this whole conversation is so important. We need to recognize how microaggressions, even in fictional settings, can contribute to real-world harm.
And this segues perfectly into the article's exploration of how media microaggressions impact society as a whole. The article makes the argument that these seemingly small instances, when they're repeated over and over again, they can actually shape our views and normalize discriminatory behavior.
It's like we're being conditioned by these subtle messages, Over time, they seep into our subconscious and actually start to influence how we see the world and interact with others. It's a reminder to be mindful of the media we consume and how it might be shaping our own perceptions, even without us realizing it.
It's easy to just dismiss these things as just entertainment, but the article really makes a strong case for how they contribute to a larger societal problem. It's fascinating and a little unsettling, to be honest.
What I found really interesting is how the article connects these on-screen portrayals to the very real psychological impact of microaggressions. It's not just about being politically correct. It's about acknowledging that these constant, subtle digs can take a real toll on people emotionally.
That's what I really appreciate about this article, It doesn't just define microaggressions, it actually delves into the real-world consequences. It talks about how people who are constantly subjected to these microaggressions, they often experience feelings of alienation, stress, and even like a diminished sense of self-worth.
Yeah.
It's not just a minor inconvenience, it can have a serious impact on someone's mental and emotional well-being.
Absolutely. It's so important to recognize that while an individual microaggression might seem insignificant, the cumulative effect can be incredibly damaging. It's that death by 1,000 paper cuts idea that we were talking about.
And it's not just film and television, right? The article also touches on how these microaggressions show up in music and literature.
That's right. And this is where things get even more nuanced, I think. The article gives the example of song lyrics that objectify women or reinforce racial stereotypes. It reminds us that art and creativity, these powerful forms of expression, they're not immune to societal biases.
I was struck by the point the article made about how even the lack of diversity in literature can be a form of microaggression. I'd never really thought about it like that before.
It's subtle, but powerful. When certain voices and perspectives are consistently missing from the narratives we consume, it sends the message that those stories and experiences aren't as valuable or worthy of being told. And it reinforces existing power structures and limits our understanding of the world.
It's like we're only getting this partial picture of reality. This actually brings us to a point in the article that I found really interesting. This whole debate around whether we're making progress or actually going backward when it comes to microaggressions in media. It presents two sides of a pretty complex argument.
Yeah, and it is complex, isn't it? On the one hand, there's definitely been a growing awareness about microaggressions, and we're seeing a push for more diverse and inclusive representation. But on the flip side, we still see instances where harmful stereotypes are being perpetuated, even if it's done in a more subtle or nuanced way.
It really is a tough question to grapple with. Are we truly moving forward, or are we just getting better at hiding those same old biases?
I think it's probably a bit of both. There's been undeniable progress, but we can't get complacent. We need to be constantly vigilant and challenge those subtle forms of prejudice wherever we see them.
And that vigilance requires us to be aware of what we're consuming, right? It makes me wonder, have you ever had a moment where you realized, oh, wait a minute, I'm actually enjoying something that perpetuates harmful stereotypes?
I think we've all had those moments, haven't we?
Yeah.
It's a process of constant learning and unlearning. It's about being open to challenging our own assumptions and being willing to see things from different perspectives.
That's a perfect segue into the next section of the article, which focuses on audience response and activism. What really struck me was how it highlighted the power of movements like #OscarsSoWhite and #MeToo in using social media to amplify marginalized voices and hold the entertainment industry accountable for its lack of diversity and inclusivity.
It's been amazing to witness how social media has really democratized criticism and given a platform to those who have been traditionally silenced. It's allowed for a more participatory form of engagement with media and has created a space where audiences can demand better representation.
The article even uses the example of streaming platforms like Netflix and Disney Plus making efforts to increase diversity in their content in response to audience demands. It really shows that these movements are having a real impact, that we're not just shouting into the void.
It's a great reminder that as consumers, we have a voice. We can choose to support creators who are actively promoting diversity and inclusion, and we can hold those who aren't accountable.
It's about voting with our wallets and our attention, right?
Right.
But the article also makes it clear that the ultimate responsibility lies with the creators and producers of media. They're the ones who have the power to shape narratives and choose how different groups are represented. It's a huge responsibility, and one that they need to take seriously.
Oh, absolutely. The article really emphasizes the importance of including diverse voices in the creative process. When you have writers, directors, and producers from a variety of backgrounds, you're much more likely to get authentic and nuanced representations of different cultures and experiences.
It's about moving away from tokenism and towards genuine inclusivity. It's about creating a space where everyone feels seen and heard and where their stories are told with respect and dignity.
I couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing that representation matters, not just for those who are being represented, but for all of us. It expands our understanding of the world and helps us to build a more just and equitable society.
I think that's such an important point. It's like that saying, if you can see it, you can be it. Representation can be so powerful, especially for those who have historically been marginalized or misrepresented.
Absolutely. It's about making sure everyone has the chance to see themselves reflected in the stories we tell and to feel like their experiences are valued and understood.
You know, this whole conversation about microaggressions in media is really making me rethink my own media diet. I'm curious, have you ever found yourself actively seeking out content from creators who prioritize diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, definitely. It's been such an eye-opening experience, really. It's opened me up to new perspectives and stories I might not have otherwise come across. And it's shown me the power of representation, not just in terms of diversity, but also in terms of authenticity and nuance.
I love that. Okay, so let's circle back to the article for a minute. It raises another interesting point, the impact of microaggressions in music. I feel like this can be a particularly tricky area to navigate because music is often seen as this pure form of artistic expression. But the article argues that even music isn't immune to perpetuating harmful biases.
Music has this incredible power to move us, to inspire us, and to connect us. But it can also be used to reinforce harmful stereotypes and normalize discriminatory attitudes. The article uses the example of song lyrics that objectify women or glorify violence. These lyrics, even though they're often disguised as entertainment, can contribute to a culture where these harmful behaviors are seen as acceptable.
It's like those lyrics become part of the soundtrack of our lives, shaping our understanding of what's normal and acceptable. I'm curious, have you ever listened to a song and cringed at a lyric that felt like a microaggression?
Oh, totally. And sometimes it's not even the overtly offensive lyrics that are the most insidious. It's those seemingly harmless phrases that subtly perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
Right.
Like, I was listening to this popular song the other day, and there was a line about a woman being crazy for leaving a man. It just struck me how that kind of language, even when it's used casual in a song, can contribute to the stigmatization of mental health and reinforce harmful gender stereotypes.
That's a really good example. It's those subtle messages, repeated over and over again, that can have a huge impact on how we view the world. It's a good reminder that we need to be critical listeners, not just passive consumers of music. We need to be aware of the messages we're internalizing and challenge the ones that are harmful or perpetuate negative stereotypes.
Totally agree. It's like we need to develop those mental antibodies to recognize and reject those harmful messages, even when they're wrapped up in a catchy tune.
I love that analogy. And this ties back to that point the article made about the lack of diversity in literature. It's not just about the stories that are being told, but also about who is telling them.
Exactly. When we limit the voices and perspectives that are represented in literature, we're creating a narrow and incomplete view of the world. It's like we're missing out on a whole chorus of voices, and with that, a wealth of stories and experiences.
And those missing voices can have a real impact on our understanding of different cultures and communities. It's like we're only getting one side of the story, and that can lead to misconceptions and prejudices.
Right, and this lack of representation can also be incredibly disheartening for aspiring writers and artists from marginalized communities. It sends the message that their stories aren't as valuable or worthy of being shared.
That's such an important point. Representation isn't just about political correctness, it's about creating a space where everyone feels seen and heard.
And it's about recognizing the power of storytelling to shape our understanding of the world and inspire empathy and understanding.
The article goes on to explore this ongoing debate about whether we're making progress or regressing when it comes to microaggressions in media. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides. What are your thoughts on this? Do you feel like we're moving in the right direction?
It's a mixed bag, for sure. On the one hand, we've seen a growing awareness of microaggressions, and there's definitely been a push for more diverse and inclusive representation. But then on the other hand, we still see those same harmful stereotypes and biases popping up, even if they're expressed in more subtle ways. It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear, and we still have a lot of work to do.
I appreciate that the article doesn't shy away from the complexity of this issue. It acknowledges the positive steps forward, but it also highlights the areas where we're still falling short. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges we face when it comes to truly dismantling these systems of bias in media?
I think one of the biggest challenges is overcoming the deep-seated biases that exist within the industry itself. It's about diversifying those voices in writers' rooms, production teams, and executive positions. It's about creating a space where different perspectives are truly valued and where stories are told from a more authentic and nuanced perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just about checking boxes, it's about creating a genuinely inclusive environment where diverse voices can thrive.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to have those tough conversations, to really challenge our own assumptions and be open to learning and growing.
The article also highlights the role of audience response and activism in driving change. It talks about how movements like #OscarsSoWhite and #MeToo have really used social media to amplify marginalized voices and hold the entertainment industry accountable for its lack of diversity and inclusivity. I was particularly struck by the example of streaming platforms like Netflix and Disney Plus making an effort to increase diversity in their content in response to audience demand.
It's a powerful example of how collective action can actually lead to real change, right? It shows that we're not just passive consumers of media. We have a voice, and we can use it to demand better representation.
It's like voting with our wallets and our attention, right? By supporting creators who prioritize diversity and inclusion, we're sending a message to the industry that representation truly matters.
Absolutely. And by speaking out against harmful stereotypes and biases, we're contributing to a culture where those voices are no longer tolerated.
The article also emphasizes the responsibility of creators and producers in shaping narratives and avoiding microaggressions. It argues that they have this unique opportunity to influence how different groups are represented and to challenge those harmful stereotypes that have persisted for far too long.
I think that's crucial. Creators have so much power, and with that power comes a responsibility to use it wisely. It's about being mindful of the stories they're telling and the messages they're sending. It's about ensuring that their work reflects the diverse world we live in and that it contributes to a more just and equitable society.
That makes so much sense. It's about recognizing that representation isn't just some passing trend. It's a fundamental aspect of creating meaningful and impactful work.
And it's about recognizing that everyone, regardless of their background or identity, deserves to see themselves reflected in the stories we tell.
This conversation has really made me think about how powerful media can be in shaping our understanding of the world. It's a reminder to be more critical of the content we consume, to seek out diverse voices and perspectives, and to use our own voices to advocate for change.
I think that's a great takeaway. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable media landscape.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap of the key points we've covered so far. We started by defining microaggressions and exploring their subtle but insidious nature. We then dove into the evolution of microaggressions in media, from those blatant stereotypes of the past to the more nuanced yet still problematic portrayals we see today. We analyzed specific examples in film, television, music, and literature, highlighting how these seemingly small instances can perpetuate harmful biases and shape our understanding of different cultures and communities.
We also talked about the very real psychological impact of microaggressions, emphasizing how these constant subtle digs can really affect someone's mental and emotional well-being. And we explored that ongoing debate about progress versus digression, acknowledging that while there's been progress in terms of awareness and representation, there's still a long way to go in truly dismantling those systems of bias.
We also highlighted the power of audience response and activism in driving change, giving examples of how movements like #OscarsSoWhite and #MeToo have held the entertainment industry accountable. And finally, we emphasize the responsibility of creators and producers in shaping narratives and avoiding microaggressions, stressing how important it is to include diverse voices in the creative process.
It's been a really comprehensive and thought-provoking discussion so far. And I think it's important to remember that this conversation isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about fostering a greater understanding of these complex issues and working together to create a more just and equitable media landscape.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into microaggressions, I'm left wondering, where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the first step is to keep having these conversations. We need to keep talking about microaggressions, keep challenging those harmful stereotypes, and keep pushing for greater diversity and inclusion in all forms of media.
I completely agree. And it's not just about talking, it's about taking action. What are some concrete steps we can take to contribute to this positive change?
Well, for one, we can be more conscious consumers of media. We can choose to support creators who prioritize diversity and inclusion, and we can speak out against content that perpetuates harmful stereotypes. We can also use our platforms, whether it's social media or our personal networks, to amplify marginalized voices and advocate for change.
It's like we all have this collective responsibility to use our voices and our choices to shape the media landscape, right?
Exactly. And we can also support organizations that are working to promote diversity and inclusion in the entertainment industry. There are so many incredible groups out there doing amazing work, and they really need our support.
I love that. It's about putting our money where our mouth is and supporting those who are actively working towards a more equitable and representative media landscape.
And it's about remembering that this isn't just about the entertainment industry. It's about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone. The way we portray different groups in media has real-world consequences. It shapes our perceptions, our attitudes, and our behaviors.
That's such a crucial point. This deep dive has really highlighted how microaggressions, even though they're often subtle, can have a huge impact on individuals and society as a whole. It's a reminder to be more aware of our own words and actions and to challenge those harmful stereotypes whenever we see them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world, both on and off the screen.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. I want to thank you again for your incredible insights and for sharing your expertise with us. This has been such an enlightening conversation.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me. It's been great to really dive into this important topic with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration. We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought about the media you consume and the world around you.
Remember, change begins with awareness. By recognizing those subtle forms of bias and challenging those harmful stereotypes, we can all contribute to creating a more inclusive and equitable world.
Until next time, keep diving deep. I completely agree. And it's not just about talking, right? It's about taking action. What are some tangible steps we can take to actually contribute to this positive change?
Well, for starters, I think we can all be more conscious consumers of media. We can support creators who are prioritizing diversity and inclusion, and we can speak out against content that perpetuates those harmful stereotypes. We can also use our platforms, whether it's social media or just our personal networks, to amplify marginalized voices and advocate for change.
It's like we have this collective responsibility to use our voices and our choices to really shape the media landscape, right?
Exactly. And you know what else we can do? We can support organizations that are working to promote diversity and inclusion in the entertainment industry. There's so many amazing groups out there doing incredible work, and they really could use our support.
I love that. It's about putting our money where our mouth is and supporting those who are on the ground actively working towards a more equitable and representative media landscape.
And it's also about remembering that this isn't just about the entertainment industry. This is about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone. The way we portray different groups in media has real-world consequences. It shapes how we perceive things, our attitude, our behaviors.
That's such a crucial point. This whole deep dive has really shown how microaggressions, even though they're often so subtle, can have a huge impact on individuals and on society as a whole. It's a reminder to be more mindful of our own words and actions and to challenge those harmful stereotypes whenever we encounter them.
I couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing that we all play a part in creating a more just and equitable world, both on screen and off.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up this deep dive on. I want to thank you again for your amazing insights and for taking the time to share your expertise with us. This has been a truly eye-opening conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to dive into this important topic with you.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this journey of exploration. We hope this deep dive has given you all some things to think about in terms of the media you consume and the world around you.
And remember, change starts with awareness. By recognizing those subtle forms of bias and challenging those harmful stereotypes, we can all do our part to create a more inclusive and equitable world.
Until next time, keep diving deep.